All right, let's delve into chapter 1. We're going to be looking at kind of an introduction to the human body. First, let's define anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is all about the structure. What does something look like? What type of cells is it made up of? How do those cells come together? Is it more than one tissue, multiple tissues, all four types? Whereas physiology, it's all about the function. How does that structure dictate what that organ system, that tissue, whatever we're talking about, what it does? So, anatomy is structure and physiology is function. And these two things definitely go together. There's this idea of principle of complementarity, that anatomy and physiology are inseparable, that form follows function. And we can very much see that what a structure can do depends on its form. So, what a structure can do, what its function is, what its physiology is, depends on its anatomy. Let's take a closer look at anatomy. There's gross or macroscopic anatomy, where you have large structures that are easily observable, meaning you don't need a microscope. Regional anatomy is looking at a structure in a particular area of the body, like the thoracic cavity, where you have the lungs and the heart. Or we could look not just at the heart itself in the thoracic cavity, we could systemically look at it. Systemic anatomy looks at just one system, like the cardiovascular system. So we go further than the heart, and we would look at both the heart and blood vessels. We can also look at the surface of the body and see how internal structures relate in that overlying skin. Now, there are also other types of macroscopic anatomy, so that's just a quick look. We also have microscopic anatomy, where we have very small structures where we definitely need a microscope to view them. For example, looking at cells is called cytology. That's the study of cells. Histology is the study of tissues, and there's other subsets of microscopic anatomy. And in both macroscopic and microscopic anatomy, you can see bits and pieces of developmental anatomy depending on what you're studying. One heavy developmental anatomy topic is embryology, where we're looking at structural changes of an individual from fertilization to adulthood, and embryology is specifically looking at that fertilization and growth of a zygote. Here you can see some images depicting those topics of anatomy. You have regional anatomy, where we're looking at the ventral or front body cavity that contains things like the lungs and the heart and the liver and the small and large intestine. We see an overview of all of the body systems, like reproductive and muscular and endocrine and digestive. We're going to be slowly working our way through body systems in Anatomy and Physiology 1, and that will continue into Anatomy and Physiology 2. And that last image is histology. It's showing you many different tissue images. Most of these are epithelial tissue, but there's a fair mix of muscle and connective tissue in there as well. And we'll learn more about those when we get to a later chapter. Just like we can look at subsets of anatomy, there's also subsets of physiology. And a lot of the physiology subdivisions are specific to individual organs or organ systems. Like renal physiology can look at just the kidneys, or it might expand to the entire urinary system. Neurophysiology can be looking at the brain or the spinal cord or peripheral nerves or the entire nervous system. And cardiovascular physiology is looking at how the heart and the blood vessel, or one or the other, are working within the body. When we're talking about how something functions, when we're looking at its physiology, oftentimes we're focusing on events that are at a microscopic or cellular and molecular level. So you want to consider principles of physics, chemical properties, and physical properties more with physiology than with anatomy. So speaking of that organization, we're going to look at basic structural organization on how we study the human body. Science is very organized, and we carry that over into anatomy and physiology as a course of study. So the smallest level that we're going to start with is the chemical level. We'll start with atoms, which are the smallest units of matter, and they can come together to form molecules. Multiple molecules can then come together to form tiny structures you find inside of cells called organelles. And those organelles are just some of the structures inside single cells, which leads us to the cellular level. Single cells have a cell membrane, they have an inside and an outside, so they have all the properties of life, so we call them the smallest units of life. If you have multiple cells that have a similar structure and function, we've moved up to the tissue level, where you have these groups of similar cells carrying out a similar idea and function. And if you have multiple tissues come together, usually at least two or more types, you're talking about an organ. For example, blood vessels. Blood vessels are made up of epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and some of them are even innervated by nervous tissue. So when we're talking about an organ, it has to contain at least two or more types of tissue, but most of them contain all four types. And if you have more than one organ, we're talking about organ systems, so that brings us up to the organ system level. And organ systems and organs themselves work really closely together. So on an organismal level, all the organ systems made up of organs are working together, combining to carry out processes like metabolism, digestion, reproduction, growth. And so we're looking at the whole organism when we encounter or take into account all of the organ systems. Now, if you're a pathway or blueprint or picture person, this is going to be something that's a little easier to study. So this is the same information, looking at that level of structural organization, going from smallest to largest, or I could say from microscopic at the top to macroscopic down at the bottom. And we're going from chemical, cellular, tissue, organ system, to organismal level. Definitely know that order, know smaller to large and large to small, and the general definitions of each. This is the image you find in your textbook, though, showing you visualizations for each one of these levels. We can see the chemical level, we have atoms coming together to form molecules. Multiple molecules form bigger structures called organelles, which are in cells. From the cellular level, if we combine those cells into groups of cells that have similar structure and function, we get a tissue. Here we're looking at smooth muscle cells combining to form smooth muscle tissue. And from the tissue level, we can then move to the organ level. Now, there is smooth muscle inside of blood vessels, but we also find epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So you can see the many different tissues coming together make us move up to that organ level. And multiple organs create organ systems. So the heart and the blood vessels come together and move us to the organ system level, where we can look at that cardiovascular system. And if we were to look at all of the body systems together, we would move to the organismal level, where we're looking at the human organism and what it's made up as a whole. I also want to revisit tissues just a little bit. Again, they are groups of similar cells with a similar function. There are four basic tissue types: epithelial, muscle, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. In general, epithelial tissue covers and lines. Muscle provides movement via contraction. Connective tissue is going to be cushiony, so it's a very supportive and protective tissue. And the nervous tissue is a great communication tissue and uses electrical impulses to do so. The reason I go through these is because wording such as epithelial, muscle, or tissue are utilized very early on in this course. But there is a whole chapter that will cover all of these tissues and their subdivisions. Now, when it comes to the four basic tissue types, in order for something to be an organ, it has to be composed of at least two of those tissue types. But again, many organs are composed of all four. All right, next we're going to be looking at organ system interrelationships, so make sure to watch that video as well.